Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the inaugural Dam Guru program webinar. My name is Peter Graham. I'm currently the head of digital at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School, and I'm delighted to be hosting this first webinar. I'm going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes and then open the webinar up to questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be available in due course. If you do have any questions or comments subsequently, please do feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and chat directly. So the subject of this webinar is digital asset management in higher education. This is an incredibly broad topic, and so I've decided to focus primarily today on my experiences of using DAM for brand management in higher education, and specifically how it can be used to build brand toolkits. Universities are generally treasure troves of assets, and although I've used DAM to meet other business requirements over the years, such as opening up heritage collections or managing e-learning assets, there's only so much that you can cover in 20 minutes. So my background, I'm currently responsible for a wide range of digital communications, but I'm formerly a project manager from King's College London. So my background has been in higher education for, well, over 10 years. I've managed a number of DAM projects in that decade, some of which have been in the private sector in consultancy roles. And perhaps slightly unusual for somebody who works in who has managed DAM projects, most of my roles have been based in communications and marketing teams rather than IT. Universities are uniquely complicated organizations, and all of them have a brand. Some have world-renowned brands, some really you've never heard of. Many of them place varying levels of importance on their visual identity, and we all know that a brand is much more than a visual identity, and obviously a visual identity is a lot more than the assets that compose it. So managing these assets is obviously vital, but it's only one part of a much greater picture. There's a lot of thinking on the subject, which I don't intend to explore fully today, and obviously as I work at a business school, I constantly hear discussion about branding, marketing theory. At the most simplistic level, I think a DAM system and the processes that develop around it, it can play a really vital role in providing people with the tools that they need to work with branding and marketing. I do think there's a combination of two key factors that allow this to happen. And the first is a great brand toolkit layered on top of the DAM system. And the second is a culture of internal engagement, really bringing people in to your project and to the outcomes that to where you want to get to at the end of it. And preferably, we'd all have a world-class reputation and a strong visual identity to work with as well, but we're not all that lucky. And everybody has a different bag of tricks to get started with. So basically, a university is an organization with generally a very high level of bureaucracy and a political structure. Branding is one of those subjects where many universities at a senior level, I think, struggle to perceive the value. They struggle with the value of branding. There are often tensions between an academic community and professional services staff, and they often have very different conceptions of what a university actually is and the extent to which it should behave like a business. Cambridge itself, it calls itself a self-governed community of scholars. There are exceptions, of course, and the appreciation of the importance of branding tends to be inversely proportional to the age of an institution and sometimes to its wealth. Cambridge is one of the world's oldest universities, and at 800 years, it's possibly one of the most well-known educational brands in the world. But there is a general feeling that brand speaks for itself and doesn't need to be managed. Where I previously worked at King's College London, they take marketing much more seriously and have a central marketing team of around 80 people. Cambridge itself has no central marketing team. At the business school where I currently work, we take our identity much more seriously because we work in a more competitive subsector of the market. We compete with other top business schools for a relatively small pool of potential students, and this can be quite challenging when competing against the likes of Harvard Business School, we have some very complex stakeholder relationships in university that makes a dam project potentially quite challenging. Authority, whether it's purchasing or decision making, is not always where the organizational chart suggests it might be. And there's also a potential challenge in as much as many marketing and communication staff are relatively junior and lack experience outside of their particular institution. They tend to identify with their institution or the course that they market rather than with their profession, and perhaps don't have broader marketing experience that helps them to see the value of something like a brand toolkit. So last year, we went through an extensive rebranding exercise. This slide on the right-hand side, you can see some pages from a brochure. It's a bold and simple design based around messaging. And this was a challenging and, it's fair to say, somewhat complex project. And what it really demonstrated to me was the way that internal engagement is just so vital to actually making brand assets and guidance available and useful across the business. So this is particularly where DAM as a concept comes in. Generally, we're under pressure. There's a downward pressure on public finances in the UK, all manner of cuts, lots of negative publicity about that cuts. Makes it harder to recruit the students, makes it harder in the international market because it becomes more expensive to come to the UK. And it also makes the decision making that I alluded to before a little bit harder to access. There's a lack of brand awareness, the politics I mentioned, and the age of the institution. So the situation that we find ourselves in, assets are always spread across all manner of different places, local hard drives and so forth. I even in my last project encountered a box full of zip drives in the cupboard. So in order to actually bring clarity to this, we introduce a DAM system. We sometimes badge it as an image library, but this again is just the start of the journey. And it's actually composed really of several key elements. Obviously you have hosting. Hosting I'm going to come on to in a little bit. You need a good website that sits on top of it to present the outcomes and the tools that you've developed. Ideally that would be managed in a content management system so that people can actually update it without having old school HTML editing skills. You need a web-based image library to present these assets. Sometimes DAM systems have complex backends, and they really do need an intuitive user-facing image library that works in the kind of way that people anticipate. You need an online set of guidelines, something to set clear expectations for non-designers about what everything is for. A logo finder can be very helpful. University logo systems can be very complex. Web-to-print systems are extremely helpful. There's a lot of routine office documents that to many people are actually the front face of a visual identity. So forms, posters, things like this, even if one gets into a list and sees posters that are on brand, it really does help people to understand the coherent identity to an institution. So internal adoption of the brand toolkit equals advocacy of a brand. This is something that I tend to, a strap line that I tend to tout around, but I genuinely do believe that this is the case. To overcome this resistance to change that you encounter at universities, you have to work on building a culture of champions, people who are genuinely enthusiastic, and to educate users about the brand and why it is important. And of course, you also, and this is really, really an important part, but many DAM vendors will tell you this, but you need a great system that matches your requirements. And this is really, the better the user experience, it's so critical, and it's more likely that internal engagement will be successful. Users are now accustomed to using Facebook, they're accustomed to using Dropbox, LinkedIn. They have all these great user experiences. And if you try to force them to use a system that really seems dated and counterintuitive, you're going to struggle to get that take-up that you need. So how to actually run a DAM project in a university? Well, there's as many ways as there are ways to run manage a project. I tend to emphasize an agile approach. I think a key decision early on is to think about whether you're going to go with an IT hosted situation internally. This obviously depends on the complexities of your organizational silos, how your IT team operates, what kind of capacity they have. Commercial hosted solutions offer fantastic flexibility, and you can deploy a solution within a few days. But then there's always the potential possibility of encountering legal compliance issues somewhere down the line, policy issues and so forth. And also you tend to encounter a cultural tension between marketing and IT departments, which is much like the relationship between the chief information officer and the chief marketing officer that's often talked about in technology blogs and the sort of consultancy material that comes out of companies like Gartner on a fairly regular basis. The IT teams are often stretched, and many are weighed down by a landscape of legacy systems such as payroll and library catalogs and so forth. And these often can stretch their priorities in ways that take them away from your marketing objectives. And it brings us back again to this idea that people conceive of a university in different ways. So the users have to see the benefits, and they have to understand why this type of project, why this type of system is actually of value. And you can do that by introducing it gradually and introducing different aspects of the system and getting it into the bloodstream in a slow and methodical fashion. I can't emphasize enough that governance is important in running a DAM system. Likewise, holding regular status updates and meetings with stakeholders to bring them in and keep them informed. Not everyone will actually have a role to play in the project, but what I've discovered is that everybody likes to feel like they're involved and to feel like their voice is heard. I think often in a private sector business, perhaps, you get on with something, you know what the objective is, and you achieve it, and you deliver. Here, we have to really bring everybody with us and move forward. Sometimes patronage can be important at a very senior level, and I think buy-in from, well, what you consider to be board-level people is absolutely vital. But really, you do need that grassroots support. You need that network of people, those champions who are just willing to say, you know what, if I could go to my image library and if I could find a Word template that would help me produce my poster in half an hour when I'm under pressure, those are the guys that you really need to bring with you. So we're reaching the end. It's been a rapid 20 minutes. I've tried to cram rather a lot of thinking in, I suppose. In conclusion, or at least in summary, my view is that internal engagement is both where you want to get to, in as much as you want people to engage with the brand, but it's also the method to get there in higher education. You can't really make people engage and input into your project or the brand itself without building trust and making other people's lives easier. If somebody has time to actually concentrate on their day job rather than sourcing imagery and finding the right PowerPoint presentation, if they can go to a one-stop shop for that and have that kind of self-service, then really they'll come along with you and see why this is actually something that serves everybody and really helps. When people tell me about their DAM projects, I always ask them, what is your success scenario? For me, my success scenario is generally, I think, in terms of case studies. So if an academic, he prepares a presentation for a class the night before, and he says to me that it was astonishingly easy to find what I needed, and it was easier than it would have been otherwise, to me, that's a success story. I don't think so much in terms of ROI in universities. I think about those little anecdotes, those pieces of feedback, things where people come back to me and say, this is how you helped me out. This is how DAM helped me out. This is how my brand toolkit helped me out. Even if they don't really understand those concepts or know what that is, you've made their jobs that little bit easier. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to any questions. Any tips for evaluating software across teams? Who should be included in the evaluation? It's a very interesting point. I mean, again, this is very dependent on the kind of organizational structure that you have. I mean, every higher education institution is, of course, different. There are some common themes. There's an argument that says that the leadership of something like evaluation should be driven from an IT team. I'm not sure that I do agree with that, because the people who really know what the business requirements are in the business. They're in your marketing team, they're in your design team, your e-learning team, and so forth. I do think that, again, this kind of approach of inclusivity, where you bring people with you, I think that's probably the best way. Include as many stakeholders as you possibly can. Don't worry too much about seniority. Try to get a good mix. Try to get people whose voices are heard as well as people whose voices should be heard. I mean, this is really where a large panel of people who, perhaps they don't all have something to contribute, but at least they feel like they've been consulted. So next I have, did you offer any organized training for users? It's an interesting question, actually. I've done both over the years. We've offered, one of the two major projects that I managed at King's College London, we offered a very structured training course. It was something that people would sign up to months in advance, and they would, well, turn up at sort of 20 people and sit in a classroom. We'd have somebody lecture them. We'd offer different modules, even perhaps a small qualification at the end of it. That was more in more old school, what I consider to be back-end DAM, as opposed to working with a brand toolkit. In terms of the things I've done later on, I've tended to be a little bit more relaxed about that. One of the reasons is a lack of resources, but the other reason is that I think people have become much more web savvy. So if you can try and create your brand toolkit to be where they are, in their experience, to be where they are and what they expect, then they need a lot less training. People are accustomed to using iStock Photo. People are accustomed to using Facebook photos. So if you try to keep things as simple and the user experience as close to what they expect, I think you're really onto a winner there. I mean, for more advanced users, people who perhaps use design software, they use plugins, perhaps they use Adobe InDesign and they need to use a desktop plugin, absolutely, I think training is required. Quite often you'll need to perhaps bring in somebody from your DAM system vendor to take that kind of training, or a consultant that specializes in that area. But it's very much based around, well, A, what your users need, and B, what you can provide them. So my next question here is your DAM used across the university, or is it only for your department? The DAM that we're using in Cambridge is only currently for the business school, at least in terms of its formal scope. There are another 6 departments which are also using it, and we're doing this on an informal basis. Cambridge is composed of well over 100 different top-level organizational bodies, and it's quite a complex institution. Introducing something university-wide is unusual, to be fair. So things tend to start at a small level, and if they're successful, they grow, which is what I hope is happening with our current DAM system. And I do believe that's the case. The largest DAM system I've introduced was at King's College London. It was the second system there, and that actually currently has about 600,000 assets, somewhere in the region of 500 regular users, and that is very much a corporate system which is used across the university. That's facilitated by the structure of that particular university, which has a central IT team. Cambridge, as I think I've probably got the message across there, is somewhat more complex. The next question I have is, how do you around others thinking branding is a marketing thing? Okay, I think the question is, how do I deal with those who think that marketing doesn't belong in academia? That's a very different, well, that's a challenging question, and probably, to be honest, the topic of a webinar or presentation in itself. I suppose I'm slightly luckier in my current environment because some people do understand the importance of marketing, and we do understand the importance of getting students on the programs and making tuition fees. I think you probably have to concentrate, if you don't live and operate in that kind of environment, you probably have to concentrate on the slightly more ephemeral and less tangible benefits and approach it from the heritage management angle. Perhaps DAM is a method for managing your archives. Perhaps DAM is a method for looking after recordings of lectures and presentations and things like this. A very good colleague of mine who recently managed a DAM project at another UK university uses it to manage photographs, early photographs from the days when the structure of DNA was discovered. And so for them, their DAM system was introduced from the perspective of managing precious digital assets. And then they've grown that from there to produce a brand toolkit and to extend that out to a marketing perspective. Do you involve students in the management of your DAM? Not currently, no. And That's primarily a resource issue. There are also political issues. In one of my previous projects, we did try to get students involved, but there are serious cost issues as well. So if you consider, let's say you've licensed the DAM system for 5,000 staff, and that's fine, and that's probably, to be fair, cost a fair amount of money. To then expand that out to 30,000 students in terms of user licenses, hosting, asset management, and so forth, that is a significant investment. You have to be sure, I don't really like, as you will have gathered, return on investment, but you really have to be sure that you're getting something back for that the service will be valuable, and that the students' needs aren't better met by Google Drive or Dropbox, something that perhaps just manages their files. It's a very difficult question. I've never yet, on any scale, encountered a DAM system that really caters to students. Now, providing a brand toolkit to students is an entirely separate issue, and we definitely do that. We provide toolkits of student society logos and various other aspects that are particularly tailored to them. The next question I have is, have you been able to tie financial results, cost-cutting, revenue generation, or time to market to your implementation yet? Invariably, yes. One does have to write reports at different times. I tend to have to do less, perhaps, in my current job at Cambridge than in my previous roles, but we talk about KPIs a lot in higher education research. And I have indeed had to, yes, cost-cutting. I think I actually understand the underlying question there. It can be difficult to talk about implementing new systems and purchasing new software in times when people are perhaps losing their jobs or functions are being downsized. Sometimes there can be a case to build a business function, even in times when individuals are perhaps having to make changes to their professional and working lives. There are various equations and so forth that you see out there, and certainly many DAM vendors will give these to you, and they will say this is how you work out how getting rid of one person essentially and introducing a DAM system can save you X amount of money over 5 years. That's not culturally particularly a way that people like to think in higher education, but I think with the downward pressure on costs increasingly, that type of reckoning is something, or even the question of, if you have a DAM system, do you need a design team of 3 people, or can you get by with one who manages the assets and an outsourcing contract? These are difficult questions. They're resource questions and they're leadership questions, and sometimes it can be quite unpleasant. Sorry, the next question is, in my bullet list before governance, parallel work streams. Yes, I did rather gloss over that, for which I apologize. I found that in running DAM projects, it's very helpful to separate out your work streams into 4 thematic areas. Technology, obviously, you can't underestimate that, so that's one. Design, and I'm thinking particularly here web design when you're talking about layers that sit on top of your DAM system. That's also obviously absolutely vital, and brings me on to user experience and information architecture. That obviously, if you think about this in terms of how a standard website project works, those things are really, really, really important. And the 4th thing, of course, and this is sometimes the most time-consuming, depending on what scale of assets we're talking about, is content and content migration, thinking about legacy assets and how you get those into your new system, what kind of policies you introduce about retention, whether indeed you do need to migrate all your legacy systems, or indeed start from scratch. My final question down here is, in a corporation, marketing typically owns the brand. Indeed, yes. But who owns the university's brand? Who's in control? Well, there's an interesting question. And I think there are as many answers to that as there are governance structures in universities. One could argue that every member of the university community, students, staff, professional services staff, alumnus, alumna, all of those have a vested stake in the brand, and they own that brand, and what they go out there and they say about the brand defines it. And I think that's very true, and I think there's also generally a weight of history behind these things. I certainly feel that, working at Cambridge. On a more practical day-to-day level, if we're talking about the brand as in a visual identity, well, that depends on where it sits in the organizational chart, really. That's your design unit, that's your marketing department, your PR team, communications team, sometimes corporate services. It can be very complex. And I'm not sure that there's any one answer. And that is a question that tends to get debated very heatedly, especially in times when there are reorganizations happening. I don't think there's any entirely correct structural answer. I do think branding tends to sit quite well with the marketing department. The marketing department is well resourced and forward-thinking. When I worked at King's College London, corporate visual identity sat in a separate function, and there was inevitably tension between them and the marketing department. But ultimately, yes, as I say, it's an organizational and a political question. Thank you all for your time. Much appreciated. I've very much enjoyed speaking with you. And yes, I hope you'll all tune in for the next Guru webinar in due course.